Today's 9/11 letter is addressed to all Radio 4 listeners and is by Joseph O'Neill.
I moved to New York in 1998 and was there on September 11th, 2001. I believe this is why I've been asked by the BBC to write and indeed read this letter to you, because I was in New York on 9/11 and you most likely were not. You were here, or somewhere else, but not there. I was there. It's this difference that makes me the reader of this letter and makes you the listener. All of this puts me in mind of a little drama involving the great essayist Susan Sontag. In the week after the September 11th crimes, Sontag complained about the language being used by public figures and TV commentators to discuss what had happened. Where, she wrote, is the acknowledgement that this was not a cowardly attack on civilization or liberty or humanity or the free world, but an attack on the world's self-proclaimed superpower undertaken as a consequence of specific American alliances and actions. How many citizens are aware of the ongoing American bombing of Iraq? And if the word cowardly is to be used, it might be more aptly applied to those who kill from beyond the range of retaliation high in the sky than to those willing to die themselves in order to kill others. In the matter of courage, a morally neutral virtue, whatever may be said of the perpetrators of Tuesday's slaughter, they were not cowards. Sontag, of course, got into trouble for this. She was accused of many things, among them insensitivity and lack of patriotism. The most basic accusation was that she had misread the situation. A few weeks later, she uncharacteristically admitted to second thoughts. She wrote that on the day of the attacks she had been in Berlin, stuck watching the events on television, stuck, as she put it, with a mediated experience. On returning to New York and seeing Ground Zero for herself, she came to understand that, quote, the reality of the devastation and the immensity of the loss of life made my initial focus on the rhetoric surrounding the event seem to me less relevant, end quote. What Sontag was confessing was that she wasn't there on 9/11 and that this led her into error, an error cured once she'd returned to New York and was able to see things for herself. To put it another way, Sontag suggested a hierarchy of seeing and feeling, with those who were there higher up in the hierarchy and those who were not there lower down. But what does it mean to be there? Take my case. In 2001, I lived about 2 miles from Ground Zero on West 23rd Street. I first heard about the attacks when I was heading out for breakfast, and someone in the lobby of my building mentioned that a plane had crashed into one of the Twin Towers. I thought little of it and walked over to my local diner for breakfast. As I stepped into the diner, I glanced at the television behind the counter and saw in real time the second plane hitting the South Tower. I stayed in the diner for a little while watching the television coverage, which was also bringing news of the attack on the Pentagon and of another plane that was missing. Then I went home and watched more on television. At a certain point I went to the roof of my building to see the towers for myself, but the one tall building in South Chelsea obscured my view of downtown, so that all I could see was that vertical track of black smoke. I returned to my apartment and watched one tower collapse live on TV. Then I was told of a plane that had crashed in the Pennsylvania countryside. Then the second tower collapsed. Later that day I went to the supermarket and stocked up on provisions. It seemed like a good idea. A friend of mine came by and told me that he was going downtown to take a look and asked if I wanted to join him. I told him that I'd seen enough. And that was pretty much that, as far as my being there was concerned. It's true that for months afterwards, convoys of motorcycles and ambulances roared and wailed night and day on the street below my apartment, transporting the human remains as they were discovered. But nobody I knew had been killed or injured, and the meaning of the convoys was soon reduced to that of a nuisance. My situation, in the end, was essentially no different from your situation and Susan Sontag's situation on the other side of the Atlantic. For almost all of us, 9/11 was largely a TV spectacle. But for others, it wasn't a TV show. It is almost impossible to think without quickly giving way to horror and fear about those who found themselves on the planes or those who found themselves in the wrong parts of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. As for those forced to choose between jumping to their deaths from a skyscraper and not jumping and being consumed by an inferno, it asks too much of us to put ourselves in their shoes. Faced with an appalling inequality between our situation and the situation of the victims, our inclination as bystanders is to suspend our critical faculties. We, as it were, defer to them, the victims, granting them the power to define the event and its reality. They will teach us how to think and feel. In this way, we compassionately privilege the dead and their loved ones and signal our guilty recognition of our good fortune. They died, we were left untouched. They were there, we were not. But who or what, exactly, is a victim? After the Al-Qaeda attacks, there was an immediate rush to claim the prestige and status of victim and survivor. Within days of 9/11, there were New Yorkers wearing T-shirts stating, "I survived September 11." And before long, there were people all over America who felt that even though they had been nowhere near the attacks, they too were victims of sorts, because they were Americans. I should mention that I was a citizen of Ireland in 2001, but in 2007 I also became a US citizen. Does this mean that I retroactively became a victim of the 9/11 attacks? In any case, if a country can be a victim of a crime, then the United States was a victim. The massacre of almost 3,000 civilians of over 70 nationalities was a grotesque crime against humanity. But as Susan Sontag pointed out, it was intended and felt above all as an act of violence directed at the USA. This whole idea of national victimhood is very interesting, and after 9/11 it turned out to be very consequential. I don't think it's impermissibly insensitive, then, to draw attention to a partly symbolic dimension of 9/11. Until that day, the American mainland had never come under significant military attack. After that day, perhaps the last remaining important fragment of American exclusivity, the freedom from external violence, was lost. America was no longer exceptional. America was now like everywhere else. The 9/11 attacks accordingly represented, in the most horrifying way, the vulnerability of even the superpower to the forces of globalization. Now that's an ugly word, globalization. But ugly though it may be, it efficiently refers to a reality that confronts us more acutely by the day, it seems, which is that nation-states and even superstates like the European Union or the USA can only exercise a marginal and inconsistent influence on outcomes for their citizens. Our national governments seem powerless to prevent economic calamities, in case you haven't noticed. We also know all about the ever-increasing movement of people from one part of the world to another, as if borders didn't exist. And of course there are certainly very few borders anymore to contain the movement of culture and information. If we want to find out what life is like in Kazakhstan or Chad or the Marshall Islands, we can go online and get a pretty good idea. What this amounts to is a revolution in proximity. We are close to people who previously were distant. The distinction between here and there is not what it was. The events of 9/11 were a demonstration of this fact. Around the world, people watched the same television scenes and felt the same horror. In short, we all have new neighbours. Now, the ethical importance of the neighbour is an old one. We're all familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan, which appears in the Gospel of Luke, but we may have forgotten that it stems from the book of Leviticus, where it is stated, "Thou shalt not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself." Perhaps it is unsurprising that a lawyer referred Jesus to this passage and asked him, "Who is my neighbour?" Jesus answered with the story of a Samaritan who came to the aid of a Jew, and in this way he affirmed that we should not only care about our own people, but also about people different from us. And here in Britain, if I can use that phrase, from New York, the law of negligence famously rests on what's called the neighbour principle, the neighbour being the person to whom one owes a duty of care. So we have an ancient and ingrained interest in the welfare of our neighbours. And this is what makes contemporary life so challenging, since we have more neighbours than ever, and they don't live next door. But it's not only our consciences that face unprecedented demands, it's all the intellectual and emotional senses with which we try to understand what's happening to us. It seems harder and harder to follow what's going on. Who could have guessed that the habits of Greek taxpayers would matter so much to us? I suppose there are two basic ways to respond to the new neighbourhood. One might be to bury your head in the sand. This isn't a modus operandi with a great track record. The other option might be to adapt one's way of looking around. The business of seeing is ultimately a political one. What we do depends on what we see. When I look back at 9/11 now, I see first of all that the idea that we should take our moral and political cues from the victims was based on a fantasy that the victims would be heard. In fact, the Bush administration immediately appropriated the voices of the victims and immediately assumed their privileged status. The clearest and most significant example, of course, was when the administration disregarded international law in order to launch a war against Iraq on the exceptional, and it turned out false, basis of preemptive self-defense. At some level, most of us assented to this, even if we protested it. I can't say what was going on in the mind of Tony Blair, but I think it's fair to say that many of us confused our human wish to give our support to suffering Americans with the giving of a carte blanche to their government. When I look back, I see that empathy for the victims produced a second fantasy, the fantasy that there is a reliable correspondence between suffering and insight. The Americans suffered, and therefore, one felt, they had superior access to the truth. Who were we to strongly question their assertions about what had happened and what should be done about it? But we can now see that the American people were badly placed to understand what took place on 9/11 and in its aftermath, and could not, or would not, grasp the simple fact, for example, that the tyrant Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with the attacks. This was, I suppose, understandable. It was very difficult 10 years ago to know what to think. It was even more difficult because the Bush administration systematically aggravated and then exploited the fear and disorientation Al-Qaeda created. The calamitous, largely fantastical war against terror that followed was not only a disaster for the United States, but for the rest of the world. It turns out that those watching 9/11 on television in due course became its victims too. It turns out that those who were not there on 9/11 were there. So where are we left, with our powerful hindsight and our globalized horizons and our boundless duty of care? I'm not sure. But it does occur to me that if our lives can be shaped by faraway events, the reverse must also be true. We can influence what happens elsewhere. Here and there are becoming the same place. This suggests a new neighbourliness, a new politics, and, if we look around, a new way forward.
Joseph O'Neill with his 9/11 letter. You can hear the next one at the same time tomorrow. It's by Lionel Shriver, the author of We Need to Talk About Kevin. The 9/11 letters are produced by Beatty Rubins.
It's Monday, September 10th.
An ordinary day.
The high 82, 77 degrees and cloudy.
With normal news.
The dominant mood in the market at the moment is almost get me out at any price.
Everyday concerns.
So today we declare war on bureaucracy.
A day just like any other.
It's Monday, September 10th, 2001.
The day before 9/11.
There's too many of our kids in America who can't read today. And now it's time to wage war on illiteracy.
The day before 9/11. On BBC Radio 4 this Saturday night at 8.